And obviously, we as Kashmiris, our position is really where do we go from here, both on blockade as well as on the political issue of self-determination, which is a human rights issue as well. So, Minister, it is all for you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Pastor Tambu, honorable members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen. There are many people here who are not only more familiar with Kashmir but have been working for the implementation of the Kashmiris' right to self-determination under very adverse conditions. I've been interacting with Shol Sahab and of course Rambu Sahab for many, many years and have seen the problems they've confronted, but their determination is an inspiration also to keep the fight going. I just want to clarify a few things which people tend to forget, because this absurd position of India's that Kashmir is an internal issue is really not based in any reality at all. And the few points I think that we need to keep reiterating. One is, of course, that India took the issue to the UN Security Council, and the point to remember there is it took it under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, not Chapter 7. So it accepted the fact that this was an international dispute between two members of the UN Security Council, because Chapter 6 refers to Pacific settlement of disputes. Had it gone under Chapter 7, it would have accused Pakistan of aggression and so on, but it did not. So I think that's a point to remember, that India's admission that it is an international dispute is first and foremost premised on the fact that they took it to the UN Security Council under Chapter 6. We also talk about 11 plus UN Security Council resolutions that have been passed on Kashmir over a period of time. It's one of the longest, and 70 years it's been on the agenda of the UN Security Council. But here again, there are two resolutions that I think are extremely important and which we need to keep highlighting. Because often the Indians have been using this excuse that, well, they've had elections and so on, and therefore the issue of plebiscite is irrelevant. But there are two UN Security Council resolutions, one of 1951 and one of 1957, which categorically state that elections to the Constituent Assembly are not a substitute for plebiscite. So clearly the UN Security Council has a very clear position on the only option being a plebiscite to resolve the Kashmir dispute. Of course, what has happened since then is that qualitatively the situation in occupied Kashmir has altered after August the 5th with India's illegal annexation or attempt to annex Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. This is actually straight out of the Israeli playbook. And Pakistan's narrative that the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, has been stating, and very effectively, is that what the Modi government is doing is exactly the same as what the Nazis did. This is a fascist government implementing a fascist agenda. And if you look at the illegal annexation, it's exactly what now the Israelis want to do. They've been moving towards it in the so-called deal of the century, which is not a deal so much as an attempt to completely annihilate the Palestinians and deny them their right enshrined in the UN, again, especially of the two-state solution and Palestine being an independent state. Other than that, of course, we all know that India is a signatory to the 4th Geneva Convention, and the illegal annexation is in direct contravention to that. As is, of course, we have now the ICJ advisory opinion on the Palestinian wall, which says that any change in the status of an occupied territory or change in demographics is actually equated to a war crime. So India now is effectively guilty of committing war crimes by its actions in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Also, of course, what is very disturbing is that as far as I know, it was the European countries that pushed for the R2P principle to be adopted in the UN and globally, the responsibility to protect principle. And now we have seen a complete silence on the part of these very so-called flag bearers of human rights, as suddenly they refuse to implement a principle that they advocated in the first place, that if there is an attempted genocide, if there is a feared genocide, or you fear it will happen because of actions that are taking place, then the international community has a responsibility to intervene in that region. But that is not happening, and that is unfortunate. I think what is equally unfortunate, despite the upbeat message we're getting from Europe, is that the Council of the European Union, in its present priorities for 2020 vis-a-vis human rights and the working of the Human Rights Council, they have failed to even mention India as they've highlighted and identified different human rights issues. That is disturbing, that here the European Union, the Council of the European Union, which supposedly represents a group of countries that supposedly claim that human rights is the principle guiding their foreign policy, has somehow or the other had a memory lapse on what is happening in India and in occupied Kashmir. And I think, therefore, we need to pressure the European Union on that. And the other issue, of course, is that the European parliamentarians have more than 200 have prepared a resolution on condemning what's happening in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And many EU member states individually have also condemned what India is doing. And yet, the European Council has adopted a different approach. So my question, frankly, is to the Europeans, who represents them? Does the Council represent them? Does the Parliament represent them? Who represents them? This is an issue that we need to also take up. Then I want to come to the issue of state terrorism that India is propagating. The old hackneyed narrative against Pakistan that India kept repeating, the mantra of terrorism that Pakistan is supporting, it doesn't wash anymore. It's hackneyed, it's not accepted. After August 5th especially, India has lost all credibility, if it ever had any, on that narrative. So now the new narrative is clearly one where the world knows that India is conducting a fascist, genocidal policy, where it wants to change the demography of occupied Kashmir, where it wants to destroy the identity of the Kashmiris, and it is quite ready to do that by force. And that is where the situation rests at the moment. And India has used force shamelessly over decades, but now with a greater intensity than ever before. We have live ammunition being used against peaceful demonstrators. We have pellet guns being used, including against women and children. And I also want to point out that there are many women rights organizations, women empowerment organizations who talk of women, protection for women against harassment, who talk about women empowerment, women rights. There is also a UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Yet, no state and unfortunately, no international women NGOs have taken up the issue of rape being used as a weapon of war by Indian security forces. This is not something new. 1991, correct me if I'm wrong, February 23rd, 1991 was Pushpora and Kunan. Mass rape carried out by Indian security forces, where they went into these villages, took the men and women aside and did a mass rape of the women there. And that case is documented in Indian court, in Indian courts as well. So it's not something I am inventing. There's documentary evidence for that. And yet, again, my question is, why is the world and why are women organizations and NGOs not taking up the issue of rape as a weapon of war used by an occupation force in occupied Kashmir. So that is another question that begs an answer. And again, all the European states, the US, Canada, they take up issues of women and protection of women, empowerment of women, but they are not prepared to comment on abuse of women in an occupied territory, an internationally recognized occupied territory, which occupied Jammu and Kashmir is. And that also, I think, is a question that begs an answer. Sadly, it has not been coming. I think, though, that the a fascist ideology creates, based on hate, always leads to bloodshed, and we are seeing that bloodshed. The world is silent after what happened on 5th August in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Now that bloodshed has come right to the capital of India itself, which is Delhi, while President Trump, who seemed to have had blinders on because he refused to accept what was happening, the burning of mosques, the torture of Muslim men and youth, lynching of them, the Indian police going into women, Muslim homes and actually sexually assaulting women. All this was happening while President Trump was basically talking about the tolerant and democratic India that he somehow saw. I don't know how, because there's not much left of that within India itself either. So what do we want to see and where should we proceed? I think that first thing we need to do is that in the UN Human Rights Council, there are now 2 reports of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on Kashmir, and those need to be acted upon. We need an investigation, independent investigation commission to go and see for themselves the violations that are happening in Indian occupied Kashmir. We also need to now have another report by the High Commissioner's office, especially in the light of what happened on August 5th and post-August 5th, because of the changed situation of the illegal annexation. A new report is required, a follow-up report, to be able to now show how things have deteriorated and how now the open violations of all international humanitarian laws, all international treaties that India is party to are taking place. The other issue is that we also need to be more active in the UN. I think one of the steps that we need to work towards is perhaps to get a consensus in the General Assembly, or at least a majority of the votes there, to perhaps seek an ICJ advisory opinion on the illegal annexation, because the ICJ has set a precedence in its judgment on the Israeli wall, and therefore it will be hard-pressed, despite Indian pressure, to go against its own precedents that it has created. I think also, and I hope, and I'm sure our diplomats are working actively on it, to have, once the regular sessions of the UN Human Rights Council are done, to perhaps have a special session of the UN Human Rights Council on Kashmir. It has had numerous special sessions on Palestine and other issues. There is a need to have one on Kashmir, I think, as well, and we should work towards that. I think the international community, especially the powerful states, need to take some form of action, be it sanctions, be it other measures, to show India that what India is doing now is simply not acceptable. You know, I had meetings with a number of international NGOs who are actually doing a lot of good work. They're the ones who have been exposing what India has been doing in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and now what India is doing to the Muslim population, its own Muslim population in India. But we keep hearing the argument that, you know, there are other issues also of human rights abuses and so on. But the point of difference is, Kashmir, like Palestine, is a recognized occupied territory, and therefore the UN has a responsibility and the international community has a responsibility to implement the resolutions that the Security Council passed, because this is a dispute that is international, it is a recognized occupied territory, and therefore it can't be equated with many other areas where human rights abuses may be taking place. The case of Kashmir is only identical to the case of Palestine because they're both recognized as occupied territories. And just in passing, I want to mention that the resolutions, Security Council resolutions on Kashmir are identical to the resolutions that were passed on East Timor. Absolutely identical. And yet the international community not only gave the East Timorese freedom fighters Nobel Peace Prizes, but they also ensured that a plebiscite would be held, and it was held. So what is stopping the international community? And this begs the question, is it because Indonesia was a big Muslim state and the East Timorese were Christians fighting that, and so it was kosher to have the referendum? And here Kashmiris largely are Muslims, and there's this big Hindu state now. We can't say secular state because now it's very much a Hindu state, and that is the occupied power, and therefore the world feels that in its new, because Islamophobia is gaining ground, because the biases that we see against Muslims in different parts of the non-Muslim world are increasing, so it's okay for India to conduct genocide of Muslim Kashmiris in occupied Kashmir. That is a question that it's an uncomfortable question. We need to ask it of our European friends, especially because they see themselves as flag bearers of human rights, and they are found wanting very badly on this. So some of the demands that we made yesterday when I spoke on behalf of my country at the council was that all illegal actions done by India from 5th August onwards should be immediately rescinded. This is what the Council should demand from India. The Council should also demand the release of all the political leaders, the youth, the human rights activists who have been arrested and detained. And this includes over 1,000 minor boys, youth who are minors, who have been forcibly taken from their homes and sent to prisons across India, and we don't know where they are. And those who have been released have been forced to sign pledges of silence. The other thing we want is, of course, a drawdown of the over 800,000 military personnel in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. It is rightly now seen as the largest open prison in the world, because Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir is effectively a prison where the security occupation forces have a free run to inflict all sorts of abuse and torture on the Kashmiris. We also demanded that the Council should ask of India to give access to independent human rights organizations and to be able to assess for themselves what is happening, because right now no independent journalist or even Indian opposition leaders are allowed access into occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Also, of course, we want the Human Rights Council to, as I said earlier, to request the High Commissioner to do a follow-up report on Kashmir after the 2 reports that have been presented, because the new situation demands immediate expose and also action. Unless the UN Human Rights Council is able to have an even-handed and a non-discriminatory approach and takes action against all human rights violations, then the credibility of the Council comes into question, just as the credibility of the EU Council has come under question after the strange priority report that they have printed. As the Secretary General said in his address to the UN Human Rights Council, you cannot have selective You can't be selective about human rights. You have to take up all human rights issues that occur in the world, but especially those that are on the agenda of the UN itself, including its Security Council, because these are occupied territories and there are international laws that specifically govern how occupation forces have to behave in territories that they occupy, and how the UN Security Council has expressed its commitments to giving people in occupied territories their right to self-determination as soon as possible. 70 years is a long time. It is now high time that the international community lived up to its pledge that it has made time and again and repeatedly. And even now there were 2 Security Council meetings after August 5th. So if there is this issue, it's a live issue. A genocide is being perpetrated, and we are seeing that it's being perpetrated through the violence, but also through the laws that India is illegally enforcing in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So the question is, why the inaction? And time has come to act now before the genocide happens. We saw what happened with the appeasement at Munich. Do we really want to repeat that again in South Asia? And this time, remember, there's a nuclear environment where all this is happening. And I also want to point out that India, in trying to divert attention from its atrocities in occupied Kashmir, is actually moving up the escalation ladder of war with Pakistan. We've had the use of cluster bombs that the Indian forces have used across the line of control in complete violation of the Inhumane Weapons Convention, to which both India and Pakistan are parties. And we are seeing a greater regular firing by Indian forces across the line of control. Pakistan at the moment has not reacted, but there comes a time when it will find it difficult not to respond. We will not always be able to hand over pilots who have tried to come and attack Pakistan, and we will not always be able to make these peaceful gestures. So not only is Kashmir now under illegal annexation a threat to peace in this region, but it is going to become a threat to peace globally, because remember, India is a nuclear-armed country, and so is Pakistan a nuclear-armed country. And conflict between the two will, has the propensity to spiral out of control. So for all these reasons, and also from a basic human rights perspective, since human rights now is talked about by everybody. States claim that human rights will define trade relations. States, developed countries claim that human rights will define their foreign policy. Well, let's see where this human rights is defining their foreign policies or their trade policies, because nothing on the ground reflects what these states are claiming. Thank you very much.
My Honourable Minister, thank you very much for that excellent contribution. You have laid out a very big agenda for us. As civil society, we will try to do whatever we can. There is a big agenda for the European Union over there, and I hope they will also follow that, your advice, very effectively, and for the UN as well. As civil society, on our part, we will try to do everything to see that there is a panel discussion. We will try to persuade the states to have a panel discussion on Kashmir on the UN Office of the High Commissioner's reports, and we hope that there is a follow-up report in the next session. The Honourable Minister, thank you very much for being here, being with us, and we are indeed very grateful for your continued commitment to the cause of Kashmir. Thank you, and with this, I will adjourn this meeting, but before that, there is a light lunch outside.